I'm happy to introduce today Lawrence Reed. Lawrence is currently the president of the Foundation for Economic Education. That's headquartered in Irvington, New York. He's written extensively on a number of topics, and you can go to the FEE website, FEE website, so it's www.fee.org to learn more about all the different topics that Lawrence has written on. Prior to joining FEE, Lawrence was the president of the Mackinac Center for his first 2 decades. Mackinac just is a state think tank for the state of Michigan, espousing and promoting free market principles and how liberty and free decisions can lead to the highest standards of living. He became president emeritus of the center, consuming his duties as the president of FEE last year. Lawrence holds a bachelor, a BA degree in economics from Grove City College, which he earned in 1975, a master's degree in history from Slippery Rock State University in 1978. He taught economics at Midland's Northwood University from 1977 to 1984, serving as the economics department chair from 1982 to 1984. He has been heavily involved in promoting free market ideas and the value of individual decision-making as appropriate macroeconomic policy foundations, at least over that, so from 1977 going back 32 years, both at the teaching at Northwood University and his teaching role, teaching in quotes, at the Mackinac Center. He's been involved in over 1,000, writing 1,000 newspaper columns and articles, 200 radio commentaries, dozens of articles in magazines and journals in the U.S. and abroad, as well as the author of 5 books. What he's going to talk to us today is, you can either call it a pamphlet or a short book on the myths of the Great Depression. I present to you today Dr. Lawrence Reed.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, very much for this opportunity. I'm thrilled to be here in this beautiful facility, this wonderful town on a gorgeous day. But I have to tell you something that our founder at the Foundation for Economic Education said about the weather. On particularly bad days, in the midst of a blizzard, people would be commenting about what a terrible day it was, and he would invariably say, "It's a great day." And people would want to know, well, haven't you looked out, or why would you say that? And he would use it as an opportunity to make a point and start a conversation by replying this way. He would say, "Every day is a great day." And that's my way of showing appreciation for the fact that at least when it comes to the weather, God and not the government is in charge. Are we getting a little feedback on the microphone? Is that, can you hear it? Is it a problem? Would it be better if I just used one and not both? Okay, you think it's all right. While I think of it, some of you have picked up a copy of this essay on the Great Depression. Some of you may not have yet had a chance to do so. But I want to call to your attention, we have copies out at the table. Everything I'll say to you today is in here and then some. So I hope you'll pick up a copy. Having said that, I hope you'll still stick around for the remainder of the talk. I think maybe I should turn off one of these. I hear a lot more feedback up here. How's that? Can you still hear me? Okay. Yeah. That sounds a lot better. Okay. Well, today we're going to talk about the Great Depression, and lest you wonder why we would talk about something that has long since been relegated to history, let me remind you that this was, by any measure, a national trauma for the American people that still resonates to this day. And so many of our public policies today are rooted in ideas or policies that have their origin in the 1930s. That's not always been for the better, but understanding that period, I think, is critical to understanding what good policy is and what bad policy is. And so we're going to start first by talking about the Great Depression in its total magnitude, and then I'll talk about the Depression in its 4 separate phases. This was, by any measure, the deepest and the longest depression in American economic history. It wasn't by any means the first. We'd had quite a few in American history before, but all of the previous ones were over with in the space of a year or 2 or 3 or at most 3.5 years. This one that begins in 1929 lasts at least 12 years. And I say at least because there's a good case to be made that it really wasn't over until after the Second World War. So you can add another 16 years and make a good case that this was a 16-year trough. Consumer welfare, although unemployment fell during the war years, consumer welfare did not improve during those war years. We were busy diverting resources to the war effort. We weren't making cars and refrigerators and so forth. It really wasn't until after World War II that the economy undertook a sustained growth that benefited ordinary consumers. So even if you look at the shorter figure of 12 years, that makes this Great Depression at least three times longer than any previous depression in American history. In fact, there's one that occurred a few years before the big one that began in 1929 that the history books have almost forgotten. We had a very sharp downturn in 1921, one of the deepest downturns in American history, but it only lasted about 8 months. Unemployment soared, the stock market collapsed. It was clearly depression levels of economic growth or contraction. And yet we don't remember much about that one because it was over so quickly. And I have to tell you, this gives you a hint of maybe where I'm coming from in my general perspective on the role of government. That was the last depression that government responded to pretty much in what I would call the proper fashion. It slashed its burdens on the economy. It slashed the top income tax rate from something like 73 to 24%. It reduced government spending. This was a depression that hit us after several years of inflation of money and credit that helped accommodate the expenses for World War I. But in the retrenchment, the government did the right thing and basically got off the backs of a sick economy, and it recovered very quickly. The Great Depression is a very different story, and I think it's best understood not as one big 12 or 16-year lump of something, but rather as a depression that has 4 distinct phases. And so I'll present it to you now in terms of 4 phases of the Great Depression. The first phase we call the monetary or the financial phase. This is the phase that explains why it happened in the first place, what made it start. And the subsequent phases will explain why it lingered and for a time even deepened before things turned around. The first phase has its roots in monetary policy. And that's, of course, something that's been conducted since 1913 by our central bank, the Federal Reserve, which badly miscalculated in the 1920s and 30s. It first engineered a very substantial expansion of money and credit that fueled the boom of the Roaring 20s. An expansion that by some estimates was as much as 60 to 65% in the nation's money supply. Professor Murray Rothbard has written a great book called America's Great Depression, in which he traces this very substantial inflation of money and credit. It began in 1924, and it started to reverse in late 1928. But for about 4.5 years, money and credit expanded in this country by clearly a double-digit rate, maybe as much as 60 to 65%. This is the time of the Roaring 20s. We had a land boom in Florida. Does that sound familiar? We had a soaring stock market. Much of the newly created money and credit found its way there. We had interest rates at rock bottom lows. The Fed drove interest rates to near 1%. A lot of folks look back at that period and say, well, where's the inflation? We don't see prices having risen very much in the 1920s. Well, you do if you look at the right things. If you look at land in Florida, if you look at the stock market. But prices probably, on balance, would have risen even more throughout the economy if we didn't have, at the same time, some rather positive things that were helping us. Namely, the drastic reduction in income tax rates engineered earlier in the decade under the Harding and then Coolidge administrations. That helped to expand the economy substantially, and the cascade of goods and productivity helped to offset what the Fed was doing with money and credit. So we were deceived for a time by thinking, hey, things look pretty good. We don't have much inflation, except maybe in the stock market and land in Florida. But it was nonetheless real, it was substantial, and the inflation was undermining the long-term sustainability of economic growth. It was in late 1928 that the Federal Reserve, becoming a bit alarmed at what its inflation had begun to create, thinking that perhaps it was fueling a speculative boom, reversed its policy and began to slow the growth rate of the money supply, then later to contract it. And in fact, what begins in late 28, in hindsight, will become a 3.5 year contraction of the nation's money supply by about 1/3. Now, if you've ever wondered, why does the economy seem to go through these booms and busts, this roller coaster, look at monetary policy. And you'll find that it too looks like a roller coaster. In the 20s and the 30s, you had precisely that. You had this dramatic growth rate in money and credit, followed by a contraction, 66% growth rate by some estimates, followed by a 1/3 contraction. You have some people who like to say, well, once you have inflation, of course you shouldn't have done it in the first place, but once you've done it, then it's a good thing to stop it and then withdraw that currency and credit and contract to stabilize. I'm of the school of thought that says don't inflate in the first place, but once you've done it, then at some point, as soon as you can, stop it, but stabilize, don't contract. The idea that an engineered deflation is the cure for an engineered inflation is like running over a man with a truck and then deciding that the way to help him out is to put it in reverse and back up over it. And that's exactly what we did with money and credit policy. We dramatically raised the money and credit supply, drove interest rates to rock bottom levels, and then later contracted it, jacked interest rates way up. In real terms, they became quite substantial by the early 1930s. This explains why the Depression begins in 1929, this erratic monetary policy that first fueled a bubble and then burst it. Some people will look at the stock market crash of October 1929 and say, well, that's what caused the Depression. The stock market fell apart, and then it dragged everything else down with it. But that would ignore the fundamentals that I just talked about. The stock market was mirroring these substantial changes in monetary policy. In fact, if you look back at those days, although we talk about Black Thursday, October 24, 1929, and there was a Black Monday and a Black Tuesday, before the end of the year, it would be black every day of the week, and with the stock market plummeting. But the stock market actually peaked out in August of 1929. We had a lot of bad days before the big crashes in October, and there's a reason for that. The smart money, like the Joseph B. Kennedys, the Bernard Baruchs, the people who are a bit more sophisticated in their investing and they know what to look for, and they watch things like money supply, what Congress is doing, trade patterns, and so forth, they saw the change in monetary policy before the general public did. They saw that the Fed was taking the punch away from the party, was raising interest rates, and it was the pressure of the smart money selling their stocks that caused the market to top out in August and begin a decline. It wasn't until the masses of people sensed change in the air and stampeded that you then had those very, very bad days, day on end, in the stock market in October and November. If nothing else had happened, I think we might have seen some recovery in 1930. And maybe this would have gone down in history as one of many of those short episodes of difficult times that we rebound from in short order. But something else did happen in 1930, and that leads me now to the second phase of the Great Depression. Think back, if you can, from your knowledge of history to 1930. You might recall that we didn't yet have a depression. Through the spring of 1930, we didn't have a depression here. We had bad days on the stock market, but it had already regained half of the ground that it had lost. Things were not looking so poorly in the spring of 1930. We regained much of that ground. And unemployment, by the way, was only, in the spring of 1930, 8.5%. It was less than it is today at 10.2. That's not depression levels yet. This is just a bad recession. What takes a recession in 1930 and makes it very quickly a depression? We call the second phase of the Great Depression the disintegration of the world economy. The disintegration of the world economy. Here's what happens. First, understanding the backdrop. The Republican Party is in charge of the House and Senate and the White House in the person of Herbert Hoover. And back in those days, maybe less so today, the Republican Party was the protectionist party. The Democrats were known, going back to Grover Cleveland and before, as the free trade party. So you have this high, nagging unemployment with just a few months to go before the midterm elections. Republicans decide, with the help of some Democrats, that they need to do something to get this 8.5% unemployment down, so they pass the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff, passed in June of 1930, signed by President Hoover, which raised tariffs to an all-time high and virtually closed the border. The thinking was, well, to put those people back to work here in this country, we need to raise taxes on imported goods, enough to make it too costly for Americans to buy those things, and instead then they'll buy goods made here at home, and that'll put those people back to work. That was the thinking, but it had precisely the opposite effect. And here's why. You cannot close the door to imports without sooner or later closing the door to exports. Trade is ultimately a two-way street. If foreigners cannot sell their goods here, how can they earn the dollars that they need to buy here? So it would have been bad enough even if foreign governments hadn't retaliated, but they did. They made matters even worse by imposing higher tariffs on American goods. Smoot-Hawley ignited a worldwide trade war, and trade ground to a halt. So industries that were dependent upon the import trade, the export trade, were heavily hit. One in particular in this country, and this will be of special interest to Kansans, I think, because you were hit especially hard because of the importance of this industry. One industry in America was especially hard hit because it had been selling about a third of what it produced in overseas markets. And now with the stroke of the presidential pen, those markets disappeared. And the industry I'm thinking of was agriculture. American farmers were selling about a third of their production in overseas markets, but now foreigners couldn't buy it. They couldn't sell their goods here, so they couldn't earn the dollars that they needed to buy American goods. So you may have seen old newsreels of American farmers dumping milk into ditches or killing large numbers of baby chicks because it no longer paid them to raise them to maturity. Farm prices plummeted. Naturally, you just wiped out a third of their markets. At the same time, you have the Federal Reserve contracting the money supply. So you have these farm bankruptcies by the thousands all across the country. This will have a spiraling downward effect because with the bankruptcy of so many farms, you have then the bankruptcies of many rural banks. You look at the massive numbers of bank failures in the early 1930s, and you'll find that overwhelmingly they're concentrated in rural areas, largely because of the impact of Smoot-Hawley on the nation's farmers. Thousands of farmers walked off the farms in bankruptcy in the wake of Smoot-Hawley. And that 8.5% unemployment will, within a year, rise to well beyond 15%. And ultimately, incidentally, the worst of unemployment will yet to be achieved or realized. It will reach as high as 27-28% by 1934. So here you have this awful situation made much worse by an act of Congress in 1934. There's another event that I include at this point, even though it isn't related to the world economy, but it happens before the third phase of the Depression, so I throw it in here, but it is very substantial in its impact. It happened in 1932. What do you suppose is occurring with the federal budget by 1932, with massive bankruptcies, people not investing, their businesses are going broke, they're out of work. You can imagine federal revenues are falling through the floor. But Congress was not of a mind to reduce expenditures to meet the shortfall. So you had this yawning and increasing federal budget deficit. There was an increasing concern in Washington. So they decided in 1932 to try to fix the deficit problem. Well, you can attack a deficit a couple of different ways. One is you can reduce expenditures to meet the shortfall, or you can try to get more revenue. And so in 1932, opting for the second course, in the midst of a massive depression with unemployment way into double digits, what did they do? They passed the Revenue Act of 1932, which doubled the income tax. The top income tax rate even more than doubled. It was raised from 25% to 65%, more than doubling at the top rate. And it included many other tax hikes, excise taxes and what have you. One of the most gargantuan tax increases in American economic history, and it came in the midst of double-digit unemployment. So what that meant was if you happened to still be standing after Smoot-Hawley, if you were still making some money, now you really got it. Now you had to pay as much as 2/3 of what you earned at the highest levels to the federal government. 1932 was also an important elite year for other things, other reasons. It was a presidential election year. Can you imagine being Herbert Hoover and running for re-election in 1932? When you came into office, things looked pretty good. It was part of the roaring 20s, and now you've got this massive, nearly 20% unemployment. You've closed off trade, you've doubled taxes, and now you're going to ask the people to re-elect you? That was probably a lost cause from the beginning. But what made it worse for Hoover was the fact that he was up against a very charismatic, silver-tongued orator, the governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When Roosevelt ran in 1932, this is unfortunately lost to history. So many of the history texts are written by, I think, by people who like to make the case for more government, so that they don't often point this out. But if I had been around in 1932 and believed, as I do now, in less government, not more, I would have voted for Franklin Roosevelt. Because he ran on a platform, this was part of the 1932 Democratic platform. He promised to reduce federal expenditures by 25%. That was a plank of the Democratic Party platform. Cut federal expenditures by 25%. He attacked Hoover, and here are FDR's own words, he attacked Hoover for presiding over the greatest spending administration in peacetime history. He attacked Hoover for raising taxes and massively increasing spending and all the other, so many of the other interventions that Hoover gave us during those years. Roosevelt's running mate was from Texas, John Nance Garner, and he made this accusation. He said Herbert Hoover was leading the country down the path to socialism. So, hey, if you believed in less government in 32, you would have voted for FDR. But it didn't take long after the election that he won in a landslide to discover he had no intention of doing any of that. And he gave us, in fact, quite the opposite. That brings me now to the third phase of the New Deal. The phase of, third phase of the Great Depression, the phase of the New Deal. Okay. And you all know the New Deal is the term to describe FDR's package of legislative initiatives. Many of them made their way through Congress in his first 100 days. He was a virtual economic dictator. Congress was eager to try something. Here was a guy who seemed to have the answers and certainly could give great speeches. He had the confidence and support of the country. He could have gotten through just about anything. There are two pieces of legislation that I want to zero in on in this third phase, because they were by far the most destructive and more impact on the economy than anything else. And by the way, this is a very interesting year from 33 to 34. So dramatic were the changes. I was reading something here recently, and a historian pointed this out to illustrate the dramatic shifts. He said, by 1934, you will have Roosevelt seizing private ownership of gold, seizing private gold. under penalty of $10,000 fine or 10 years in prison. You had about a month and a half to turn in your gold. And at the same time, I think he decided that the country needed a good stiff drink, and so he pushed for the repeal of prohibition. And those two things happened within a few months apart. So if you think, in 1933, if you had two men walking down the street, one of them with a bottle of booze in his hand and the other one with a gold coin in his pocket. The one with the bottle of booze was the crook, and the one with the gold coin was an honest citizen. A year later, it was just the opposite. The guy with the gold coin, he's in violation of the law. The one with the booze having a good time after years of prohibition. So here we are. He takes office in March of 1933. And the first of these two pieces of legislation I want to zero in on is the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, which created a new bureaucracy called the NRA, the National Recovery Administration. The idea behind this law was that there was too much competition in the American economy. The problem was that prices kept plummeting, and every time some business was able to get prices up, somebody else would come along and undercut it, and that was hurting economic recovery. Okay, so we have to do something, FDR thought, to curtail competition. So this act was an attempt to organize American industry along the lines of cartels, with price controls, and to raise prices to get businesses all singing out of the same hymn book, to prevent them from undercutting each other through lower prices. This raised the cost of doing business on average by some 40%, which again, in the midst of the Depression, when your profits have disappeared and your costs are out of line with your prices, you're not making money, the last thing you need is a law that forces your costs up even more. Remember too that one man's price is another man's cost. So when you force prices up over here thinking you're going to raise the income of those folks, you've just cut the income of others by the same amount. This is redistribution through mandate, through force, in contravention of market forces. One man in particular, we often talk about when we discuss the NRA, because he is a great symbol for the oppression of this act. His name was Jack Megan. He was an immigrant and a tailor in New York City. He was prosecuted under the National Industrial Recovery Act and jailed for pressing a suit of clothes for the price of 35 cents when the NRA code price was 40 cents. Now think of it, we're in a depression. You're lucky if you've got a suit of clothes to press or the money to have them pressed. And here's a guy who said, I'll do it for 35 cents. He goes to jail because he didn't charge you 40 cents. And that is supposed to stimulate economic recovery. Of course, it didn't. It was horribly destructive across the economy. But if you think that was something, well, I should tell you too. You know who Roosevelt put in charge of the NRA? And they had their propaganda campaigns, they had their parades down Main Street, they had their Blue Eagle symbol that they encouraged businesses to put in their window indicating compliance with this new federal rule. He put in charge of it a man named Hugh Johnson, who was known as Iron Pants Johnson, because he was a no-nonsense, run him down, blow him up, kick him in the face kind of guy. A real bully. In fact, he was a professed admirer, publicly professed admirer of Benito Mussolini. Now, these are the years before Mussolini becomes quite the rogue in the world, but he was known in the mid-30s, early mid-30s, as tough, strong man, making the trains run on time in Italy. And General Johnson here running the NRA wanted to imitate that. We'll give the orders and we'll make this economy recover. But if you think the NRA was harmful, when do you hear of this other thing they passed, the AAA? The Agricultural Adjustment Act. Okay, again, one of the first 100 days New Deal legislation. Agriculture was in terrible shape. I love the names they give these things, by the way. National Industrial Recovery. How could you be opposed to that? They always name these, even the most destructive things, they give them high-sounding names. And agriculture, it needed adjustment, no question. You had plummeting prices, markets disappeared, you had thousands in bankruptcy, agriculture needed adjustment. And this act will adjust it. Like falling out of an airplane will adjust your neck. Here's what it did, okay? It levied a new tax on agriculture, processing in particular, like millers and refiners. Just what an oppressed economy needs, right? Yet another tax. It levied a new tax on agriculture and used the revenue to supervise the destruction of perfectly good fields of corn, wheat, cotton, and other crops, and perfectly healthy cattle, sheep, and pigs. Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace, in one single order, ordered the destruction of 6 million baby pigs. You had a farmer who testified how difficult it was that after having trained his mules to walk between the rows, now under the AAA he had to teach them to trample the rows, and they just didn't want to do that. And every time I've thought of that since I first read it, I thought, what does that say about the relative intelligence of mules versus the politicians of that? I mean, the mules had it right. They didn't want us to stomp on this stuff. But the idea here was, well, we've got to get prices up so it's laid waste to supply. And the result will be that farmers will get more for what's left. Of course, they have less to sell. And even if this had helped the farmers, it could have done so only at the expense of everybody else. Redistribution through destruction. What a fanciful way to... I wish I could, as an economist, stand before you and say, this is the way to progress. We just find things of value that we have labored to produce and invested and saved and taken risks to produce. And we destroy them, and we'll be wealthier as a result. I wish that were true, because it's easy to do. And it's one of the things that government does especially well. But that isn't the road to progress or prosperity, laying waste to things of value. This didn't help farmers, didn't help the economy. It should be no surprise that the economy continued to slump, and in 1934, a year later, we finally reached the trough at about 27, 28% unemployment. Well, we get some relief from unexpected quarters by 1935, and the economy will start to show some signs of recovery. Unemployment will fall below 20% by 1936. But then something happens in 1937 that will devastate the economy and produce one of the swiftest collapses in American history. But first, I have to tell you, why did we get the bump up in the economy in 35 and 36? Where did we get relief from the NIRA and the AAA? From the United States Supreme Court. They ruled both of those acts unconstitutional, and they threw out other FDR legislation as well. In the process, the Supreme Court earned the unending wrath of Franklin Roosevelt, who will begin to refer to them as those 9 old men who keep, throwing out my legislation. Freed of the worst of FDR, the economy shows signs of life. But then 37, FDR achieves a first. A depression within a depression. One of the swiftest collapses in our history. Unemployment soars back above 20%. What happens in 1937 to cause this serious relapse? This brings me now to the fourth and final phase of the Great Depression. We call it the phase of the Wagner Act, W-A-G-N-E-R. Now, the Wagner Act will be the worst of 4 things I want to tell you about that explain the 37 collapse. But I'll touch on the other 3 first. All of these 4 things explain, in great measure, why the economy slumped so dramatically in 1937. One is the Supreme Court package scheme. Here's a case where what seemed to be a purely political development actually had serious economic ramifications. Roosevelt won re-election in 1936 in a landslide. The Republicans put up a kind of Me Too, colorless, oh, wait a minute, he was from next door. Oh, great man. Good guy. Alf Landon, but he didn't make it. And that was the year that spawned that famous phrase, as Maine goes, so goes Vermont. because Landon carried those. He didn't even carry Kansas, but he carried Maine and Vermont. And Roosevelt won in a landslide. You've got to give FDR credit. He could give mesmerizing speeches. He gave these fireside chats. People thought, well, he's trying, he's doing something. And so they reelected him in 36. Now, fresh from that victory, he decides to go after the court, those 9 old men. But he can't call for Congress to impeach them. They haven't done anything impeachable. They called the shots as they saw them. These 9 old men couldn't believe the stuff they were seeing and said, this is not, it doesn't say this in the Constitution. You can't do this. So Roosevelt comes up with a scheme called the Supreme Court packing scheme that goes like this. He proposed that for every justice who reaches the age of 70 and who doesn't voluntarily retire, the president should get to appoint 1 new one. And if this had passed, he would have been able to immediately appoint 5 new justices to the court, effectively packing it with people who would support his way of thinking. This was debated for quite a few months in 1937. And as long as it hung over the economy, it was a factor in the collapse that year, because a lot of business people, those who had some money to invest, I know I would have done this if I'd been around back then. I would have said, hey, I'm going to wait and see how this turns out. Because if he packs the court, then all of that stuff that we got rid of is going to come back. I don't know if I want to put my money on the line if that happens. So it was a factor, but it was the first big battle that he lost in Congress. His own party deserted him on this, and they did not pass it, so that was a good outcome. At the same time that year, he called for a very substantial undistributed profits tax. You know, when a company makes profit, it can retain some of its earnings, that's undistributed profits, or it can distribute them to its shareholders or some mix of the two. And the retained earnings, the undistributed profits, are an important source of capital for growth and expansion. Well, Roosevelt, by 37, was coming under the influence of economists like John Maynard Keynes, who told him that the problem in the economy was not enough spending. And you have these businesses that are keeping too much of their earnings instead of divvying it up to the shareholders. And we need to do something to get them to give it out to the shareholders so they'll spend it. Ignoring the fact that retained earnings don't get stuffed in a mattress somewhere, they're spent too, but more often than not on capital goods and expansion of the business. But Roosevelt, in response to that thinking, proposed an undistributed profits tax of 85%. He wanted virtually all profits American industry could generate that it didn't distribute to its shareholders. 85%. He didn't get one that high. Congress gave him one of 35%, bad enough, and they eliminated that in a year, but it realized the harm that it had done. And at the same time, throughout this period, you had Roosevelt pushing for higher taxes on almost everything. Do you know how high he will take the top marginal income tax rate before he's done? Within a few years? 91%. He comes in with Hoover's top rate in the 70s and assails him for raising taxes, but before he's done, he takes it to 91. And in fact, he proposed in Congress once, to Congress, a 98% top income tax rate. It was defeated because some Midwestern congressmen arose and said, wait a minute, we have 3 or 4% income tax rates in our states. And if he gets his 98, how are we going to get our 3 or 4? So that was defeated. But then he came back, and by executive order, after that proposal failed, by executive order, he imposed a 100% income tax rate on all incomes in excess of $25,000. Now, it's not, today's purchasing power, maybe that would have been, I don't know, $100,000. In any event, the good thing was that didn't last very long. Congress overrode it, and if it had ever gone to court, I think it would have been thrown out as unconstitutional. But this is the climate that you have. You've got the top guy in the White House constantly trying to grab as much as he can from productive people. And this was the climate in 1937. The third factor in that collapse that year was the Federal Reserve, reaping some mischief again after having adopted an accommodating policy in the mid-30s, following that contraction we talked about. Now in 37, they dramatically hike interest rates and help to choke off this budding economic recovery. But it's the Wagner Act, factor number 4, that really did us in 1937. It was formerly known as the National Labor Relations Act, and sometimes called Labor's Magna Carta. It gave us a new regime for handling labor disputes. It took them out of the ordinary courts of law and handed them over to a new agency we have to this day, the National Labor Relations Board. It gave organized labor enormous new powers to organize. This is the time of a wave of militancy among American labor unions. Sit-down strikes in places like Flint, Michigan, Detroit, Michigan, and the auto plants. The number of strike days, workers were on strike, from 1936 to 37, doubled from 14 million strike days in 36 to 28 million strike days in 1937. Dramatically raising the costs of labor. Some of the privileges that were bestowed upon unions were later chipped away by Congress, but this was a huge boost to organized labor and a very difficult thing to swallow for an already sick economy. The economy will limp along, still in depression, for several more years. 1939, 6 years after Roosevelt assumed office, his Treasury Secretary, Michael Blumenthal, gave a speech to a Democratic audience, which he recounted later in his diaries, in which he said, "We've tried all this spending, we've tried all these interventions, none of it is working." So when people tell me, "Oh, FDR saved us from the Depression," I say, "Hey, don't take my word for it. Don't take the numbers' word for it. Why don't you take his own Treasury Secretary's word for it?" They were frustrated that there was, only nascent recoveries nipped in the bud by further collapses 6 years into his term as president. Along comes World War II. You have still the feeling among many people that, well, that's what saved us. War is good for the economy. And I would caution people to not go down that path, because what makes war look like it can stimulate an economy is simply how it often is financed, through a dramatic expansion of money and credit, which only sets you up for a later correction down the road. We got a lot of that during World War II. But we also shipped 11 million overseas. That helped to reduce the unemployment rate. On the good side, the administration began to lower trade barriers, in part because we felt we had to trade with our partners in war, and that was helpful. But we really didn't have a sustained recovery that benefited ordinary consumers until after the war and after Roosevelt. It's not an exaggeration to say that the economy finally recovered when Roosevelt didn't. He died in 1945, and the Truman administration was much friendlier overall to business than was Franklin Roosevelt. He didn't have those diatribes in the White House condemning malefactors of great wealth and that sort of thing. Truman got rid of a lot of the radical New Dealers that had peppered the administration before him. And of course, you have this drastic reduction in government spending after the war, which actually helped to lift the private economy. So he who can look at this period, going back to the inflation of the 20s, followed by the contraction and mismanagement of the money supply, the jacking up of tariffs, the doubling of the income tax, the New Deal, the Wagner Act, all these other interventions, and still say, as the conventional history text tells us today, that the Great Depression was caused by the free market, and that the Roosevelt administration had to save us. He who can say that, I think, is woefully ill-informed and mistaken. With that, I'm happy to say I appreciate your being so attentive, and we'd be happy to take some questions.
I can't help but start off by asking the question, who is John Galt? But we'll leave that for another time. So, questions? We've got a few minutes for questions. Anybody wants to ask? Yes, sir.
I'm curious, you mentioned work by Professor Rothbard, and I presume you studied under the great commencement.
Yes.
New York City. And a lot has been written about what you mentioned with the Federal Reserve's expansion of the money supply prior to the stock market crash and how that's a contraction. Because a lot's been written that what the Fed needs to do is to continue to expand the money supply. We talked about that, how a deflationary period will actually exacerbate the problem. That also though creates a problem. When does it end? When should a Fed expansionary policy end? Freeman has blamed the depression on that. It seems all mainstream economists agree with that, but what's the solution?
Yeah, I think it's a sad commentary, Mike, the state of discussion about proper monetary policy. Only lately, in the aftermath of this recent financial collapse, have you had questions raised that are getting some attention in the right places about fundamental monetary policy and whether or not the Fed is the source of our problem. I think that's a healthy direction to go in. If you look at what's happened since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and all the promises that were made at that time and in the years since about what this agency would do for us, they include things like, well, we need the Federal Reserve because it will provide just the right amount of money and credit. It will promote full employment. It will iron out the business cycle. The wizards at the Fed will know these things. They can centrally plan our money and credit system for us. But you look at the record, and what have we had since? We've had one Great Depression, and we've had 9 or 10 recessions, and we have a currency that's worth about a nickel of what it was worth when they started. Now, if we had said to a private company in 1913, hey, we're going to contract with you. We want you to be in charge of the nation's money supply. We want you to iron out the business cycle, provide just the right amount of money, and preserve the integrity of the currency. And if, looking back, that private company had that kind of a track record, I think we'd be prosecuting them. We'd be saying, hey, this was a bad deal, give us our money back. And yet today, most discussion about the Fed just revolves around, well, should we have maybe different people in it? Should we, we really need to get to basics and ask ourselves, can 7 people appointed by the president be trusted to know what the proper supply of the nation's money and credit ought to be? Would we do, if so, then why don't we do that with anything else? Why don't we have a green bean board? We could have 7 people picked by the president, and they would decide what the supply of green beans ought to be for us. They could buy and sell green bean bonds. They could just be in charge of making sure they're just enough. Well, as a matter of fact, we don't have such things. We have markets, we have prices, we have private providers responding to market signals, and lo and behold, you never have to go into a grocery store and discover the shelves are empty of beans, or there are piles of them that don't get sold. Somehow just the right amount of green beans are there. The notion that you could have a handful of people know what interest rates should be, what the supply of money should be, that's at the source of our problems. We never get off this roller coaster because we never question the very existence of it.
How do you interpret and explain the collapse of the credit markets?
How do we interpret and explain the collapse of the credit markets last year? Several things. There are multiple culprits. At the core of it, and this is what really gave it its magnitude. It couldn't have happened to the degree that it did if it weren't for this. And that is, again, Federal Reserve policy was excessively accommodated for a far too long a period. They thought they knew what money growth should be, but after 9/11, they kept it too fast, too high for too long. And inflated, it produced an inflationary bubble that showed up primarily in real estate. And a big reason it showed up in real estate is because of other follies that you could lay at the doorstep, mostly of Congress, where they decided, and people like Barney Frank decided, home ownership needs even more encouragement than before. So let's lean on Fannie and Freddie to buy mortgages and bundle them for resale. Let's jawbone the banks to make mortgages to people who probably don't represent good credit risks or the ability to pay it back. We had federal policy jamming that down the economy's throat and easy money at the Fed carrying it along for a time. The Fed shifted its policy, if you recall, it was 2 years or more ago, when the Fed went from accommodationist policy to contractionary, began to jack up interest rates. That was a clear sign that the balloon was off the rose, and then we had a stampede after Bear Stearns in the spring. But those two things are largely the culprits of the collapse. The easy money of the Fed for too long, and the long-standing policy of job-owning banks and mortgage institutions to make loans they shouldn't have for political purposes.
Yeah, what do you see as the net effect of the Glass-Steagall Act also is, and it's rescinded, when it rescinded 10 years ago?
Yeah, Glass-Steagall, getting rid of it in what, the late 90s, I think, allowing for commercial and investment banks to sort of become one in effect. I don't think the effect, I think the effects of that are vastly overstated. I don't see that as a major culprit. I think that was a move to accommodate what markets were trying to get done. I don't think that was so much.
How about the passage? Was it 36 or 30?
Oh yeah, it was bad news back then. It should have been passed. It helped to delay recovery at that time.
Let's do one more question. Yes.
Do you have, if you get rid of the Fed?
I'm sorry?
If you get rid of the Fed, I mean, let's say it was evil, bad idea. The panic in 1907 was aberration. We shouldn't have reacted that way. What's your idea? Just go back to Congress to print, to coin your money?
That's a very good question. I don't like to play the role of central planner, so I don't have a grand plan that says, here's how to do it step by step. I think there needs to be a lot of work on that. I can tell you this, though, that real monetary reform has to involve mechanisms that will put the market in charge of money instead of the whims of politicians. Now, what might that look like? I can suggest a number of ways. I'm not sure what might be the best way to do it. First of all, whatever you do with monetary policy, even if you were to restore gold convertibility, let's say, will not last long if the government doesn't get its fiscal house in order. If the government announced tomorrow, we're going to back the dollar with gold, I would say, well, hey, good move. But if it still had $1.5 trillion deficits, I would say, I don't believe you. It's only a matter of time before you go off it again. So the government first has to exert fiscal discipline itself before you can make a step toward real monetary reform and stability. Personally, I'm very friendly to the gold standard, and I think it served us well. And it was when government began to adulterate it and move us away from it that we opened the door to this mischief of inflation. So I'm friendly to the notion of tying the dollar once again to gold. How to get there, I don't know precisely, but there's a good example from our history. In 1875, Congress passed a law that could be a model for us today. We had had inflation in both the North and the South. You know, in the South, of course, they had hyperinflation. They lost the war, money became worthless, but they also printed way too much of it. In the North, we had the greenbacks. So the dollar was in tatters by the early 1870s. In 1875, Congress passed a law that said, beginning on the 1st of January, 1879, all the greenbacks we've issued will be redeemable at par in gold. They gave themselves 4 years to make sure gold reserves were sufficient. And they said, at that point, you can bring your greenbacks in, and we'll finally redeem them for what we promised. On that redemption day in 1879, hardly anybody went to the banks and said, give me gold for my paper. The reason was, people had good reason to have confidence. They said, we believe them. We know the reserves are there. We'd rather use the paper if we know that it's as good as gold, and we can get it if we want to. Something like that, I think, should be part of the discussion. But we have to get away from this undisciplined approach where the supply of money is utterly at the whims of undisciplined, spendthrift politicians and their appointees. That's a prescription for disaster.
Okay, thank you.